And now Lyndal Curtis joins us with Capitol Hill, live from Canberra.
Thanks, Kim. Tonight, more funds for schools, but not enough certainty for some. This is Capitol Hill. Welcome to the program. I'm Lyndal Curtis. The states and territories are vowing to punish the federal government for its backflip on school funding. Their treasurers have been meeting in Canberra, and those who had signed deals with the former Labor government are keeping the pressure on the Commonwealth to honour them in full. But Liberal treasurers who came to Canberra to meet with their federal counterpart Joe Hockey are happy with two items discussed at today's gathering: infrastructure and GST reform.
What they've said today, they intend to play not just a talking role, they intend to play a capital role, providing incentives to the state to do additional infrastructure. So we consider that an incredibly positive step, and we look forward to working with the federal government on that. And the second was in relation to the online GST. The business case is being released, very close to being finalised. Key tenets were discussed. There is an agreement that we will come together, that is in the states and the federal government will work through every line and assumption of that business case. We'll ensure that whatever model is considered, it is done in the most cost-effective way. And at the end of March, the treasurers will come back together to make a decision in terms of going forward.
We're going to look at the assets that we have. I think what we've seen today, though, is something from the federal government we haven't seen in previous meetings, and that is a willingness to give the states an incentive to reconsider it. And as Mike has said, a very generous offer in relation to how we deal with it. And it is something that needs to be taken back, spoken to premiers, first ministers and cabinets.
The Tasmanian Premier and Treasurer is vowing not to increase the GST or to privatise any state assets in order to get access to more federal funds. She is, however, happy with plans to lower the threshold for GST on online purchases. I spoke to Lara Giddings after the Treasurers' meeting. Lara Giddings, welcome to Capitol Hill. You've been at the Treasurers' meeting today. If I can ask you first about one of the issues that was actually on the agenda, lowering the threshold for GST to apply to online purchases. Was any progress made on that?
Limited progress in terms of there needs to be further work provided to the states for us to truly understand what the benefits are of lowering the threshold. We do see this as a tax integrity issue in that currently you've got a situation where Australian businesses are at a disadvantage to overseas businesses that are effectively tax-free. And that's not fair, and in a time when we need to have jobs in Australia, particularly Tasmania, we don't want to threaten jobs because of a tax integrity issue.
Did you discuss any particular threshold?
Not a specific threshold, but we certainly do want to look at what threshold would be at a point where you could in fact pay for the cost of recovery of the tax. There is some concern right now that in fact it would cost us money to recover that tax, in which case there's not much point going down that pathway. So there is further work to be done. There seems to me to be broad support for that work, and we may well see that threshold coming down, but it's a little bit too early to say.
Now, some of the coalition states have been agitating for the issue of the GST itself to be looked at, whether it's broadening the base, increasing the rate. The federal government's including it in its review. Was there any discussion at all about those issues at this meeting?
Well, let's just be very clear that in terms of broadening the base and other changes to GST, we don't support that. But in the context of looking at overall taxation reform, I think there is broad support around the table that GST in its broad form needs to be considered. However, within that, the horizontal fiscal equalisation model that sits within the GST should not be tampered with and should not form part of any review, whether it's the Federation White Paper review or the Taxation White Paper review.
But was there any response from the Federal Treasurer?
Well, essentially the Federal Treasurer was saying to me, look, we have already ruled out any changes before the election. Now, I asked whether or not he would rule out any changes after the election, considering we've seen backflips from this Liberal government on Gonski, possibly NDIS, where we did not get any comfort there either. On, well, obviously the NBN is under threat as well, and we are most concerned that there could well be a change of heart on the GST by this federal government.
But,
and
not before an election, so
well,
they would have to put it to the people,
well,
wouldn't
the
they?
chance was here today for the Treasurer to rule out any change to GST with this HFE model and make that specific in the white papers that the Commonwealth are developing, and that chance was not taken up. That causes me great concern.
There was also the issue of infrastructure discussed and ways for the states to effectively use the Commonwealth's AAA credit rating to get some money for that. The issue of privatisation was raised. What was that discussion about?
Well, we all know that we need to invest in infrastructure across the nation for productivity gains, and that's exactly what Tasmania's doing with the Commonwealth, for instance, in our Tasmanian irrigation program, where we are investing together $400 million and farmers are investing $400 million. That's fantastic productivity gain that we're getting out of that infrastructure. But there was a proposal put on the table that if we were to privatise our assets, that there would be a way of working with the Australian government to invest further into infrastructure.
So the federal government could tip in some of its own money?
They could work with states around that on the basis that states privatise. Now, we have no appetite for privatisation in Tasmania at all. The only assets we have of real value are our hydroelectricity and our transmission electricity networks, and we do not want to privatise either of those.
Now, there will be another meeting on Friday of state education ministers, but did you ask the Treasurer at this meeting for any guarantees that the money that was promised to you on the Gonski deal, on the school education funding reforms, will be delivered in its entirety?
We certainly did raise Gonski because I am quite concerned by the change of heart in relation to this model. Now, this was a model that should be seen as being above politics. It was developed by David Gonski and a panel of people who were not politically aligned to anybody. It has been picked up by Liberal states and Labor states, and that to me is a fundamental show of confidence and support in it, and it should be allowed to continue. Now, we were given no comfort there. Essentially, the Treasurer said that is a matter for the Education Minister. I think he might be a little bit concerned that the Education Minister has found himself in some hot water and is going to have to find a way out of it, and it's a little bit hands-off.
Mr Pine said last night, and he said again today, that the $1.6 billion that was going to the 5 states and territories that had signed at least heads of agreement with the Commonwealth Government, that will still be going to those states and territories, including yours. Are you reassured by that?
No, because this is about the model as much as it is about the funding in that respect. What we have is Christopher Pyne wanting to take us back a decade to old-fashioned style of funding our schools, which was a system that was broken, which is why we had the reform come about. You have to look at our literacy and numeracy rates across the nation compared to other developed nations around the world, and Australia is not performing well enough. Tasmania certainly isn't performing well enough on a national basis, and we need change.
You have an election coming up early next year. Will you be campaigning on this issue?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, to me, you couldn't see a starker difference between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party when it comes to these reforms. You've got education reform, you've got the NDIS reform, where we are not getting the comfort we need, that NDIS reform will continue as it should continue. The NBN, absolutely critical infrastructure for Tasmania, and it must be delivered to the home or the business premise, not to the node. Now, we've put up an alternate option to the Commonwealth, and we hope they'll pick that option up if they're not prepared to follow through with the current program. But GST, big one for Tasmania. $700 million out of a $5 billion budget is a huge hit. We can't afford it.
Lara Giddings, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal.
Now to today's political panel, and joining me to discuss the day is Labor MP Alana McTiernan from Perth, and in Canberra, Liberal Senator Zed Seselja. Welcome to you both.
Thanks. Thanks, Lyndal.
Hey, how are you?
Good. We will start with education, and today the federal government announced it had found another $230 million for education.
Nobody's going to suffer, and you'll see that in my info, but the good news is that Queensland, Western Australia and Northern Territory students will not be shortchanged by the Bill Shorten shambles that I was left when I became the Minister.
Zed, Christopher Pyne says he's found money for the states that didn't sign on to the former government's funding reform. He's found that money for 1 year. If he keeps his promise to the states and territories who did sign on that they'll get the full $1.6 billion, he's got to find money for the rest of the forward estimates for the states who didn't sign on, doesn't he?
Well, Lyndal, there's a lot of work to be done, clearly, because what we've inherited is quite a mess. What the Coalition is committed to is to keep the overall funding envelope, and now we're also dealing with the $1.2 billion that has been ripped away from other states that hadn't signed on.
You say it was ripped away from states, but that money was contingent on them signing, so if they didn't sign, they weren't getting the money.
But this is money that has effectively been taken away from these states.
But they didn't sign, so in what circumstances were they going to get the money if they didn't sign?
It's money that they don't get from the Commonwealth, Lyndal, and that is the issue. And so what the Coalition has said today and what Christopher Pyne has said today is not only would the Coalition honour its promise to keep the overall funding envelope, the Coalition will also find an extra $230 million for next year to deal with the funding hole that's been created by this mess. And it is quite a mess because, you know, we often hear about the funding model, but most of it wasn't signed. We know that states and territories and, in fact, systemic schools are free to, in fact, allocate that money as they like. So all of those things undermine these claims by the Labor Party that this is some perfect model that's been agreed.
But
it's not a perfect model and it hasn't been agreed.
Just before I get to Alana, you knew going into the election, and when you made the pledge to at least honour the funding, and some of the wording was honouring the student resource standards model, that 3 jurisdictions hadn't signed up and others had, and you say they hadn't signed anything, but all 5 jurisdictions had signed at least a heads of agreement, hadn't they?
Well, a heads of agreement doesn't give you the kind of detail that we were led to believe by the Labor Party. If you've got a model that's going to say that no school will be worse off and that the resource standard will be followed, then surely you would know by now what schools were getting. We don't know that because it hasn't been agreed, and that's the difficulty that Christopher Pyne has coming in. Not only were the agreements not signed and finalised, we know that money was also taken away from some of the states and territories.
Alana, the state which has the seat you represent, Western Australia, didn't sign up to the Labor government's plan. Is it possible that Western Australia will actually be better off?
Now or later?
Now,
sorry.
now, because the federal government will give them money anyway.
Well, if they signed up with under the Labor plan, obviously they would be getting considerably more than there is the potential to get now with that allocation that has been made today, and of course that's only for 1 year. And Lyndal, look, you made a couple of really important points. I think we do have to stress that the budget situation was declared before the election, and it was very, very obvious. The opposition was at the time was totally aware that we hadn't included in PFO those sums of money for those states that hadn't signed up. So that was totally obvious. And the opposition at the time made comment about it. But I think another second important point here is the way in which Christopher Pyne is now walking away from this model. Now, you recall that Tony Abbott said we've got a unity ticket on Gonski. We are actually signing up to this package for the next 4 years. There was a disagreement about whether it be 4 or 6, but they were signing up for the next 4 years.
But you say Western Australia.
But hold on, please. Can I just say this? Go back now. Christopher Pyne is now talking about going back to the old funding model. He was saying last night, didn't see really a problem with the old funding model, really didn't accept the fundamental principle behind Gonski is that we actually did need a much fairer model to ensure that we lift the standards of education across Australia.
Isn't the $230 million that Christopher Pyne has allocated today almost precisely the amount that was nominated in that PFO document for the states for this year that hadn't signed up? So Western Australia is doing as well as it would have under Labor.
But under Labor, in order to get the money, the state government needed to sign on to make a contribution themselves. Now, we don't know whether or not that is going to, in fact, be part of the model. And we know that in Western Australia what's happening is that Mr Barnett is, in fact, taking a considerable amount of money out of the education budget. We've got massive cuts across the state. So the idea of that under Gonski was that we leverage an increased contribution from the Commonwealth by requiring there to be some increase in contribution by the state as well, that you actually magnified your benefit. And that's not unusual. That is a fairly standard way in which federal governments negotiate with the states to ensure that you get a better outcome. But it is the quality of the outcome that is really important. And this is a major walking away from a principle.
We might move on now.
Says Tony Abbott.
We might move on now to the issue of the GST. It was discussed at today's Treasurers meeting. Zed, the Coalition has promised not to touch the GST in its first term. Why isn't changing the threshold that applies to online purchases at least broadening the base?
Well, look, I don't think we should be changing the threshold. I think that the answer to the issues around online sales is not necessarily to put another tax on those sales. So that's my personal view on this. I don't see that the Australian people need more tax. I think that governments could be living within their means better than they are at the moment, and it won't fix the issue. Not only are we told that it would at least initially, and at least for some years, cost more to collect than revenue would come in, we know that the growth of online sales is not going to stop simply because the GST is added to it.
Alana, do you agree with retailers that they are being unfairly disadvantaged because people can buy from overseas and not pay the GST?
Well, clearly it is an issue, and it's not one that can be ignored. And I think, as Lara Giddings pointed out, really the critical point here is the compliance cost or the collection cost. Is it going to be economical to do it? Is the sum of money that you would attract, and it's certainly not going to create a total equality between retailers here and those overseas, but it is a measure, and I think personally I think it is something that we have to look at, but we have to be very, very mindful of the cost of collection here and whether or not it makes sense to impose that additional burden if in fact it's not going to, if we're not going to get enough additional revenue in really to make that economically sensible. So it's a factual question here that I think really has to be, and we have to wait till this latest report comes out that will give us some idea, given current technologies, collection mechanisms, whether or not this could be done cost effectively.
One of the other issues with the GST, aside from whether the rate or the base is eventually changed, is the distribution of that money between the states and territories. I'd like to ask you both about that from your local perspectives. Zed, do you think the ACT, the distribution to the ACT of GST money is about right?
Oh, look, we can always be parochial. As a resident of Canberra, of course, I'd like to see more. But I think it's in the ballpark. I don't think it's significantly less than what it should be. But it's always going to be a difficult measure. You know, we know that WA has done well out of the resources boom in recent years, and they've seen less GST. That's tough for the people of WA, and I'm not surprised that Colin Barnett asks for more. What the key, though, Lyndal, is not just about the distribution of the pie. The key is about actually growing the economy. And if we start to grow the economy more quickly, as we saw a number of years ago under the Howard Costello government, we often saw much more GST coming to states and territories than had been anticipated. And so that should be the prime focus of the federal government.
And is the principle of what's called horizontal fiscal equalisation that everybody gets access to the same sorts of levels of services a good one that still is fit for purpose?
I think it's a reasonable one, but I think if you've ever sat down with the Grants Commission, as I have, I don't think anyone can fully explain the formulas. They are very, very complex, but we know the basic principle is the capacity to raise money is taken into account in how much GST is distributed, and I think that's reasonable. I think we can always argue at the margins, but the focus should be on growing the economy so that all of the states and territories get more revenue.
Alana, the Western Australian Premier Colin Barnett has been the one who has been most outspoken about the distribution of the GST. He is very critical of the amount of GST money that is returned to Western Australia. Now, I don't recall Western Australia complaining when they were getting perhaps more of the pie than New South Wales and Victoria back 20 years ago. Is Western Australia being treated unfairly?
Well, I just think you have to look at the extent to which this is happening, and I have to say that this has also been an issue that was pushed very hard by the state Labor government, that we're now down to around 44 cents in the dollar that we get back, and next year I think we're going down to about 34 cents in the dollar. So the returns are very, very low. And I guess what I argue, and I don't think that fundamental arrangement is going to change anytime soon. But what I think is that there is inadequate amount of money. There is the potential for WA to really get, I think, a greater share of the infrastructure dollar. So putting that aside, what we see is that a lot of the metrics that are used, and this particularly occurred under the Howard government, that are used to distribute the infrastructure dollars outside of the GST are really distorted towards the economic metrics of the eastern states. So I think what has to be, whilst I don't think it's realistic to expect we're going to get a change in the GST, I think there has to be a lot more openness to the needs that WA has, because it is growing so rapidly. So in order to continue to cross-subsidise, it is actually going to need more assistance on those infrastructure items, and we need to have the economic models for those infrastructure spends to be more reflective of WA.
We might move on to our final issue of Indonesia. The Trade Minister has clarified comments earlier today that appeared to confirm Australia did tap the Indonesian President's phone. As the Prime Minister considers the President's response to his letter aimed at calming tensions over spying, with envoys due to meet in the next few days and a proposal for a security roundtable, Mr Robb now says he was trying to make a point about the Prime Minister's handling of the diplomatic relationship.
It is unfortunate that this taping that took place several years ago has been made public, but it's there. It's a fact of life. We've got to deal with it, and the Prime Minister is seeking to deal with it effectively. We don't in any way speculate, and secondly, I'm not privy. I'm not privy to those sorts of security issues, and so I'm not in any place to make any comment on those issues.
Is the problem with these issues that no government seeks to comment on intelligence matters, but everybody assumes it happens because it's not denied?
Well, look, I don't think you can assume anything. I think what we've seen is media reports based on stolen intelligence documents. I think what Andrew Robb said is 100% right. I haven't seen them. Andrew Robb says he hasn't seen them, so he can neither confirm nor deny, and nor should the Prime Minister. I think that the Prime Minister has done exactly the right thing. If he were to get into the game of confirming or denying intelligence reports or leaks, it would be a never-ending game, and it would be damaging to the national interest. So I think the Prime Minister has done exactly the right thing. This is a difficult issue. It's not of our making, but what it is the Prime Minister has to deal with it. He's dealing methodically and calmly with the relationship with Indonesia. I believe he's doing a very good job, but these are difficult circumstances, and sometimes in political leadership there are issues you've just got to deal with, and that's what Tony Abbott is doing at the moment.
Alana, Tony Abbott is now talking about more openness with Indonesia, more intelligence sharing. Is that the best way forward?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Look, we have got, we absolutely need a very strong relationship with Indonesia. We've got very strong trade connections that are important to preserve. We've got strong security connections, and obviously we are very, very reliant on Indonesian cooperation in order to manage the refugee problem. So quite clearly we have to give a priority to repairing this relationship. I think the Prime Minister needs to make sure that all his ministers actually totally understand this notion that you don't comment on the specifics of any intelligence information. that's obviously been a bit of an error. But I think both sides of politics are absolutely committed to rebuilding this Indonesian relationship. I think it's also, I do think that we do have to accept that perhaps some of the rhetoric that occurred before the election might have provided a little bit of background to the sensitivity the Indonesians have felt about the allegations in relation to intelligence. But look, both of us are taking both sides here are taking a Team Australia approach. We need to have really good relationships.
Except by looking to blame the current government. We've heard that. Bill Shorten, he's been all over the place. Then we had Tanya Plibersek doing the same thing. Now Alana, it's a unity ticket. It's a unity ticket. Except you want to blame the coalition government for an issue that they are dealing with as the incumbent government. I think that the Labor Party needs to make a decision. Are they going to be unified with us on this, or are they going to carp from the sidelines? We see more carping from the sidelines.
On that note, I'm very sorry, Alana. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today. And that is Capitol Hill for now. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Until then, good night.